Betty and Kay from that's Sandra Malibu Fry as well. Lindy Berliner.
Four there.
All right. So it seems like we have a
OPC.
I'm sorry, what?
Someone else on OPC.
Sean Scully's on the phone as well.
Okay. Turnout. Whoa.
Good.
I went to Trombone Shorty last night at the Wharf, so I can't hear.
Yesterday,
Really?
sure, for the foundation. Yeah.
Oh, it was great. It was great. I mean, eventually, yes.
Yeah.
And he said that he thought that DC gave him such a warm reception each time he was here. It made him feel like home, so he will be back. So, yeah. But anyhow, so I can't hear and I can't talk because I was shouting at the concert. But, so it seems like we have a quorum. Also, new board member, Millie Knowlton, who is not yet sworn in, learned on Friday that she was going to be able to join. She's going to participate in the audience, but she's down the hall right now making a phone call because she couldn't switch it around after having learned later in the day that she was going to be on the board. So she can come in and introduce herself. So why don't we just go around and say who we are. Vicki Corman.
Tommy Wells, Director of DOE.
Dan Wedderburn, representing the council chair.
Good morning, Kirsten Williams, representing Building Management AFL.
Good morning. I'm Ted Trabue with the DC Sustainable Energy Utility.
Lance Long, DOE.
Teresa Lawrence, DOE.
Hussein Karim, attorney with DOE.
John Mizrock, representing council chair of operations.
Great. Go ahead. Yeah, you know what, actually, before we start, I'm realizing should we have called to order so that we can get everybody's name? Sorry. Call to order.
All right.
Let the meeting begin. So just to run around again, people here are Vicki, Tommy, Dan Wedderburn, Kirsten, Ted, Teresa, Lance, Hussein, John Mizrock.
Yep.
And on the phone are Sean Scully, Donna Cooper, Betty Ann King, Sandra Malibu Fry, Lenny Berliner, and was there anybody else? Sean, got him, yeah. Is there anyone else on the phone?
Adrian from
Yes, Adrienne Henderson with OPC.
Sorry about that. Thanks. That was the one where I couldn't hear. Okay, let's go around the room.
Dan Clarendon, Public Service Committee.
Cheryl Bell, DC Sustainable Energy Utility.
Ben Bird, DC Sustainable Energy. Marcus Walker, DC Sustainable Energy. I'm Joe Sobbs, Chief Financial Officer.
Mark Wilson, DOE.
Great, thank you. So let's go through the agenda. A couple of us were speaking before the meeting. I'm not sure. Is there a printout of? No. Another draft of the report was circulated on Friday. I don't know if you guys have it up there.
Yes, it's available here on soft copy.
Okay. I think a question has arisen whether, first of all, we recognize that there was a week extension. I could talk a little bit about that in a moment. But number one, actually, before we start, why don't we let the new board member introduce herself, who's not yet sworn in. We'll hope she passes the security check. But Millie Knowlton, who's the going to be filling the building construction slot on the DC SEU advisory board. So thank you. Welcome, Millie.
Welcome.
Millie is with Tesla. Do you want to, and will be sworn in. So she will have to
It's the chair's
the chair's prerogative. Why not? Millie, pull up a chair.
Yes, thanks. So I'm joining from Tesla. I work in commercial energy, solar energy, and energy storage projects. So I'm excited to join. Cool. Thank you.
Welcome. And so just to let you know, on the phone, are Sean Scully from Washington Gas, Donna Cooper from Pepco, Betty Ann Kane from the PSC, Sandra Malibu Fry from OPC, Lenny Berliner. What is your slot, Lenny, on the board?
I'm officially supposed to be from the Economic Development Community.
Okay, great. And Adrian was at Henderson, also from OPC. And around the table, you have other board members, John Mizrock, Dan Wedderburn, Kirsten, Tommy is an ex officio, Tommy Welch, Director of DOE. So sorry, John, tell us who you're with again.
I'm representing Mary Che, who's the chair of the Government Operations and Environment.
And Dan Wedderburn represents the council, and Kirsten represents the building management and the video vote. So we were just starting to go through approving the agenda, and I was just starting to raise that we have a later draft of the report. We recognize that we're a week already overdue, and we've gotten an extension from the board, that it might behoove us to talk about whether or not we need a little more time, but it was also raised whether it might be beneficial for the board to have a closed executive session so that it might be able to have a frank discussion about the report content.
This is Sandra Mazel-Fry. I definitely support that. I've been looking through it, and I have, questions that I think would be better raised in an executive meeting.
Yeah, and I agree as well. Vicki and I talked before the meeting. I think that this is just a draft, and I think the board members ought to be able to speak frankly with each other as opposed to having others, who are not on the board, be looking over our shoulder.
So, the saying will come up with the criteria for going into closed session should the board decide to go into closed session.
Yeah.
Yes. So should we hear the criteria first before the board decides if it wishes to do so? Do you have them off the top of your head?
Not to all of them, but one of them is confidential, non-public information or data. There was a memo, if you recall, when you considered the RFP documents and you went to executive session. That figure gave us an advisory opinion. I can pull. I don't have it in front of me, but I can pull that up and look at it.
Okay. So not meaning we don't discuss confidential documents, or what is the?
Well, you cannot discuss confidential documents and non-public documents in public. So you go into executive session.
Okay.
So
If that's the reason, you have to come up with permissible reason.
yes. So I'll read the memo again, and I'll talk to you about the permissible reasons under the memo.
Oh, okay. So permissible reason is that the board members would like to have a frank discussion.
Now that you're subject to open meetings law.
Yeah, I'll have to look into it. I don't want to answer your question without looking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So that may or may not affect what we dive into in the latter half of the meeting.
So let's be clear. Is it the board's desire to go into executive session today during this meeting?
I think if possible.
No.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Say it.
I was going to say we would need the criteria prior to going into that type of the discussion. Can we get that before the last part of this period?
That's why I was asking if the board is desirous of doing that later on in the agenda. Mr. Hussain, Mr. Green would develop the rationale for the choices that the board has for the reason to go into it prior, so he could go do that now. If it's the intent of the board to go into executive session during this meeting.
I think that'll help us decide if we're going to do that today or if we can do it at all, and otherwise whether or not we would have an open meeting on it.
I agree.
I expect you can do it, but you just have to, depending on the reasons.
Yes. Okay.
Right.
So yes, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up the memo right now. I'll ask another senator to read it right now.
So, given the nature of an advisory board, I'd be shocked if we didn't have the right to have an the record conversation among the group.
I think you're right, John. I just think that if I remember right, that this board was explicitly determined I think in the legislation, I think, if I'm right, the legislation states that the board is subject to open meetings law. I can't remember.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so
Oh, I think we are like any other board. Yeah.
you are expressed.
Unless
Yes,
we are
yes,
But
going
even
to
if-
executive session.
But I believe the criteria for that, for the open meeting, would be if a decisional are being made. If you're just drafting a memo or document or report, I don't think it rises to that until we actually determine that that report is going to be filed.
That is correct. Because I do recall you had a retreat
Yeah.
that was not public.
Correct.
And there were no
Yeah.
decisions made. And that was, that was
Okay.
okay.
Right.
So,
Mr. Cream will
Okay,
give us the specific,
Criteria.
since we are covered, since we're watched
Yep.
by the media, because this goes online, that will be an express
Agreed.
action by the board to go into executive session. I
Agreed.
believe.
Okay, yeah, that'd be helpful. So let's discuss those when we get to that based on the agenda. Otherwise, does anybody have any other comments on the agenda? So shall somebody move to approve the
move
agenda?
to approve it.
Thank you. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. Thank you. So the review and approval of the September 5th and September 22nd minutes. Did folks have a chance to look at both? And I will tell you that in my office move, I did not have a chance to find again the September 5th, but I'm willing to abstain. Others want to approve. Does anybody have, or are we able now to speak to the September 5th minutes? Are they in here? They are. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's just take a quick look.
And it's interesting. There's areas of these.
Is that part of the Fishmonger Act of 1914?
It is.
But
I mean, on the one hand, it's like Mr. Market. It was great that Don Collard and the others kept it going. But when we brought in order,
yeah,
there were folks that wanted full value of everything they had gotten by adverse possession. And so to accrue the value back to Mr. Fitzgerald. Interesting. It's interesting. I'm a big believer in control matter. You know that it's got neat stuff. But now and then.
So in my neighborhood, they have a farmer's market Sunday, 3 or 4 hours. It goes off this tiny little street. I'd hate to think that the people selling stuff there could claim that they have a right to do that street.
Well, for the longest time, for the people that had the vote, little boards in the war, they got the full value of their slips.
Yeah.
And so the slip would convey. And so there's no way you can do that now after they upgraded all this.
The river for a while, that's what we're following it. Because of course
Well, they
caused
still don't.
contamination problem.
Well, not anymore. That was done at everybody's point.
So I take it everybody has done
Yeah.
reading the minutes.
But the idea that you could, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Or no, I think Dan is still taking a look. Yeah, whatever. Are you done reading the minutes, or do you want to look a little bit longer?
I was just thinking about when I was reading what I should comment on. I'm not gonna
Okay, are folks on the phone? Are people ready to move forward on the minutes?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
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 Okay, thank you. So let's start with the September 5th. Any comments, edits on September 5th? Okay, none. Will somebody want to move to approve the September 5th minutes?
I'll move to approve it.
Thank you. How about a second?
A second.
Thank you.
Oh.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
Aye.
Thank, thank you. Anyone opposed? Okay, September 5th are approved. September 22nd. So my comment on the September 22nd minutes would be that I don't think I have an issue with anything that's in here, but it's feeling like it's sparse again and isn't necessarily capturing what was discussed in the September 22nd meeting. So, for example, one of the reasons that I had requested that we get the minutes in advance of approving the agenda was because it's a helpful reminder to what was discussed in the last meeting that we wanted to follow through on in the next meeting, but I don't see any of those things here. So, for example, we had a discussion that led to an agenda item, because I remembered the discussion about the board's involvement in contract modifications. And we discussed whether or not the board had been involved in the modification that led to the minimum and maximum benchmarks, and what the processes would be going forward. That is not captured in the minutes. We had a discussion as well about whether or not the board would be able to weigh in on the EM&B contract, the criteria that are used by the EM&B contractor may not necessarily be very illuminating in terms of helping us to understand the board's performance. And I don't see that either in the minutes. So I think I at least am back to a question of if.
So I think there's two issues. One is, do you propose to amend the minutes to reflect those two items before adoption of the minutes? And then the second issue is to be sure that we have a process that captures board issues, because I know there's been conversations with internal folks to try to meet the expectations of the board. But the first issue is, do you intend to amend the minutes?
I personally am not asking for an amendment of the minutes because I remembered the things that I thought were worthy of discussion during this meeting, and they are on the agenda. The meeting meeting minutes hadn't come to me before this agenda anyway, but the things I wanted on here are on here, so I'm not asking to amend them. I don't know if anybody else is.
This is Sandra, yes. I think the agenda items are on for this meeting. However, there is some concern that of the, accuracy of the minutes and making certain that the emphasis is not edited out inadvertently because something is not captured, and so that the content for the record is not accurate. Now, Vicki, it would have to certainly be the author or the person that presented the issue that would have to make the necessary amendments, or someone review the tape to see if they could capture it accurately. But I think that there should be some reflection, particularly if it's an omission that goes to the context in which the statement was made.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add to that the two things that Vicki brought up are pretty substantive, i.e. contract modifications and specific goals, the
EM&B criteria.
EM&B criteria. And there's this third thing that has surfaced quite frequently, which is when we get stuff.
So the first thing is I don't know when you got to review I can defer to Lance on this, but I know that what Sandra said is correct. The issue was to get this on the agenda, and it is on the agenda.
Okay.
As asked for by the board.
Okay.
And Lance and Tracy, you were out, but the concern is that while you did get it on the agenda, is that it was not reflected in the minutes to get it on the agenda. And I think what the board has to be very intentional about, which I think is very helpful, is the role of minutes. Since this is not a corporate board, that it seems like the best role for the minutes would be for building the final report each year, so that you see the issues that were covered and concerns that came up. Mm-hmm. It seems like that along with the agenda, so that a review of the agenda and a review of the minutes should basically provide the basis for the annual report. Is that correct?
Yes, that's helpful. That would be helpful.
Yes. And, I just emphasizing the point that it would reflect the input of the board and the work that's being done by the board to generate discussion, further discussion, and ultimately, changes that we think are appropriate. If you don't see the nexus, then it's almost as if it, was a spontaneous decision by some, to put this on the agenda as opposed to based upon the recommendations and discussions of the board itself.
So I am going to make a friendly amendment to myself. I think that Sandra makes a very good point, which is that things ended up on the agenda because of my memory or my email correspondence, which isn't transparent. So I agree that we should ask for the minutes to reflect the origins of at least those requests that I made for agenda items.
I don't think it has to be extensive. It's just a reference, to make certain you get credit.
Agreed. And then to the extent there was more discussion that seems to be captured, I don't know if I have a recommendation for that as to it being a more useful tool for the next board report.
So in terms of that issue, first you want to make a motion?
Yes. I will make a motion to please amend the minutes to reflect the origins of my request that this agenda reflect a request for discussion of how contract modifications came into existence under the board's involvement under the prior contract and under the current contract, and my request that we have an opportunity to understand if the board can have input into the criteria that Tetra Tech will use in the next EM&V report. So that's my motion.
I'll second.
I second it.
Okay. Thank you.
It's
All
2
in,
seconds.
thank you.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Fine.
Thank you. Any opposed? Okay.
So the second issue as to the nature of the minutes, I know that internally, what our discussions have generally been to not provide you a verbatim transcript.
Right.
And so there is some judgment that goes on about highlighting the issues for the board, and we will get better at that as we go. But we're currently, we think it's burdensome to you guys to do the transcript. And so we're currently using the internal judgment of, okay, that's an issue, reflect that. And so when we say reflect discussion, I think that we will work at that until we get to the board's comfort.
Okay. And I think also, you know, in fairness, there is a video of the meeting made, and at some point later next year when we're writing the next report, maybe we'll go back and look at the videos. But in terms of keeping the board's discussions alive and going on the particular issues, I think those are especially what we want to capture. Minutes from meeting to minute.
Also, Biggie, if I could ask that the board from time to time just point out these specific things as we go along so that we're making sure we're capturing it on the minutes. For example, when you discuss things such as EM&V contracting, if it's something you know for sure you want to see on the next agenda, we'll make sure that we note it as an agenda item. Because hearing the discussion here, I'm thinking that we probably need to just have like a subheading that says next agenda items or issues to be included on the next agenda or we're writing the minutes.
Okay, that's a good idea. Just in terms of the timing on John's question, so I believe in the last meeting, maybe before, I had requested that we get the minutes before the agenda or the draft of the agenda. So the draft of the agendas come to me, agenda I never know if it's agenda I. But I think the minutes coming in advance. So the minutes did come out on Friday, which gave people an opportunity to read them for today. But I would request they come before the draft agenda comes to me. I'm not sure if you had any other thoughts on timing, John.
You know, just timely. I mean, I think again, we have often been, you know, reading it for the first time. I you know, not again, just a note saying, let's just set up within reason a time certain. Like we'll get if we have a meeting on Monday, then we'll get the minutes by Friday, whatever you think.
Okay.
I don't know what that time certain is.
I don't know, but just to note also, in fairness for DOEE, these meetings were condensed because of our trying to keep going on the report.
Right.
So this isn't the normal
No.
time span between meetings, which means there's probably going to be
Right.
more time to digest and prepare.
And this meeting wasn't formally scheduled.
Right.
Very late.
Okay, so we're amending the September 22nd minutes. So shall we go to the discussion of the multi-year contract modifications and the prior contract modifications?
The full copy of the new multi-year contract is also in the Dropbox for those advisory board members who would like to review the entire contract. It's in there under the list of documents. The most recent modification that we did was on September 28th. So I think we can just back up to show where we started and then how we got to September 28th. This contract was signed on April 5th, 2017. The first amendment that we did to this contract, as you'll notice from the documents included, this is the original signing of the contract. Jackie McDonald is our contracting officer. Scott Johnstone was then the CEO of VIC. So both entities would sign the contract and it becomes a fully executed document. This, of course, comes after council approval. Once the DC Council approves the contract, the contracting officer then signs. The first amendment we made to the contract was some simple fixes to modify some of the dates with which certain reports were due from the DCSCU. As noted here, one of the first issues we addressed was the insurance requirements. As stated in the original contract, there were mandatory flow downs for subcontractors of the DCSU to carry the same levels of insurance as the DCSU. For example, the $15 million umbrella insurance, $2 million insurance for automobile liability. There's insurance in there for environmental hazard, workers' comp, and so forth. The DCSU made a petition to us and to the District Office of Risk Management that will be too onerous, especially on smaller subcontractors who are just working on maybe $100,000 or $200,000 contracts, and you're asking them to carry $15 million worth of insurance coverage. So we met with ORM and we went through some discussions, and ORM gave us some exemptions in terms of how they will treat the DCSU subcontracts. So we had to amend the language to reflect that discussions that we had, that they will provide us with the necessary insurance levels that they're proposing. We would send that over for ORM review. ORM would provide that approval, and then the DCSU would have 30 days to update their subcontracts to reflect the new insurance requirements for their subs. Not the main insurance level, but just for the subs. And then on the bottom, we changed the lines for, again, 2 dates here that all had to do around insurance and subcontractor performance in terms of the due dates. First was due, I believe, in 30 days. We gave an extension to 60 days to allow the DCSU to be able to complete that task.
Thank you. I have a question. I guess I should have made some sort of introductory remark as to why I asked for this to be on the agenda. Mm-hmm. In the last meeting, we talked about the issue of minimum and maximum targets, benchmarks coming into the prior contract. And a question was raised as to whether or not the board had had involvement in those contractor modifications. Many of the people who were around the table were there during the time, many are not. But we were asking about the process because that issue seemed to be one that was capturing attention by people like City Paper and others, but also, our own questions as to how that came about. So we asked about the process. I asked to see the current contract because I'm an old woman and don't know how to use Dropbox, and asked for a courtesy copy to be sent to me, and it came with modifications. And in the last meeting, we said, what's the process for modifications? And I think, we had heard that the board would be consulted on modifications. So the reason I was asking to be walked through these modifications was, number one, to understand how they came about, because something like this seems, logical, like this kind of a modification. But what is the criterion the DOEE and/or the SCU would use for deciding when is a modification innocuous housekeeping and when is it substantive? And is there a decision-making step to decide whether or not it is something to run by the board or given our statutory role with regard to the contract?
So let me ask, in terms of reflecting what Lance just said, Lance, did that modification regarding the insurance coverage, was that coming through the best and final negotiations? Or?
No, it didn't come through in the best and final negotiations. This started after the contract was signed with both parties. And this, again, was just to get certain exemptions for the subcontractors, not for VIC to carry the required amount of insurance specified in the contract.
So the insurance modification went to what they require of their subcontractors?
Yes.
So the question that the chair is asking is process.
Yes.
When there is a process, but I'm not sure is if all modifications include. I think something that goes to the substance of the contract, performance of the contract, might be a little different from trying to ease the SEU's way on terms of clarifications of extending things like insurance to the subs. We'll have to make those decisions as we go. But, so I don't want to ask your questions for you.
No, that was the question, right, which was, what is the process? Because in the last meeting, I think there was a discussion or a statement that the board is consulted or involved. I don't know if it's involved after a modification is made or if it's involved before a modification is made. I think it's after. But I think that's the question, whether or not the board wishes to be involved in modifications before they're made and or at least notified that a modification may be in discussion that is substantive and goes to performance, the kind that the board is responsible for monitoring.
I'll ask our attorney, but it seems to me that I agree with you completely that it goes to the substance of the contract in terms of a modification of performance measures, where in particular in this case, the board spoke to that when we were building the new contract. The board provided input on this. But if they're going to be amended or modified, it seems to me that there should be consultation with the advisory board. I don't understand why there would be a bar or a problem with that. I'll just go to it.
I don't see a bar or problem with that, unless it's something that has to be done urgently and there isn't time to notify the board. Consult the board.
But it seems highly appropriate for the board. Anybody want to add on to that, Lance? Please.
Well, if this is dire, certainly we can do that, but historically we have never exercised that type of process. It's always been mutual agreement between the DCSU and DOE to modify the contract. Either it's something that the DCSU is proposing or something that the district needs to make changes to the contract, and we would sit at a table and make sure we have mutual agreement, and then the contract will be modified, because it is explicitly spelled out in the contract that any changes, not just to the benchmark, even if we want to change a word in this contract, that both parties need to agree to that change for it to happen on a mutual basis.
But for clarification, it's clear to the two parties to the contract. We got that. But what I'm asserting is that I agree with the chair that modifications that go to the substance of the contract, such as performance measures, in the event that there's not some unforeseen urgency that would cause economic harm to either party,
or a subcontractor or something,
that seems highly appropriate for the role of the board, especially in the light of the fact that the board helped shape and review and give us input on these performance measures. Then something like performance measures, not just performance measures, something like performance measures will come to the board for input and review.
I totally agree. I think that it's important that the board be advised of any modifications, even for the minor modifications that may not be substantive in nature, that they would be advised, and they would then have the opportunity to chime in or not. But certainly, the more substantive modifications the board should be involved.
Right, but to be clear to the board so we don't raise undue expectations, that for something like changing the insurance requirements, the board should be notified, but that change, I don't believe, should be held off until the board speaks to it, because the board is an advisory capacity, and in that case, it seems like in order for the SEU to do their work with their subs, that needed to be done. It doesn't go to the contract. So that's my only clarification, Sandra, is that it seems that there are some that the agency will need to be free to be able to perfect with the contract of the SEU without going to the board first.
So if it's a question of timing, then it still becomes notification.
Yes.
And what I'm suggesting is that the board is notified of any amendments that are being made by DCSEU and the OEE. Now, there are things that we would not, be involved in, and to be frank, because it's advisory in nature, we are only giving advice so that there wouldn't be any automatic change to, whatever the amended provision is. Basically, so what I'm saying is that I don't have a problem with notification, but I do think that we should be notified of everything. And those issues that are more substantive in nature, that go to the actual contract itself, the board should be given an opportunity at the earliest time, at the earliest possible time, that a change is being contemplated, so that advice can be given, substantive advice can be given.
So I guess I would say, I'm throwing this out there, proposal that for modifications that, I guess for lack of a better phraseology, appear innocuous or housekeeping or go to dates and things that don't affect substantive performance or things that go in particular to the performance benchmarks, informing the board of the changes when we meet would be sufficient. But for proposed modifications that do go to performance, there should be prior notification to the board and an opportunity for the board to determine whether and or how it would weigh in, which would likely come between meetings.
I just want to add that, if I could very quickly, that in my mind, this sort of goes to that philosophical question that we've had from the beginning, and something that's not been there that long. What's the role of this? Are we oversight? Are we advisory? Are we sending, suggestions to you guys, to the director, to the council, or to the mayor? I mean, I'm not asking for an answer. I'm just saying over time, this has gone around and around as to defining what we're supposed to be doing. So I think it's important it's as important, it should be as important given the fact that we have a lot of new board members, that we sort of have a sense, not today, of what this board's all about, and therefore it goes to what we're requesting. A modification in the goals is significant, and should be presented in some way, shape, or form. The church, maybe not so much.
And John, I agree completely, and that's part of why I spoke very affirmatively.
Yes,
so that you can get it in the minutes.
Absolutely.
So hopefully those that come after us don't have to revisit that question.
Yeah, and again, as I said, I'm not asking for a definitive answer, but over time,
I gave you one.
You did. No, okay. It's terrific. But what I'm saying is that the bigger picture of the role of the board has sort of has gone up and down. So, and under the current structure, I think I feel very good about it. I feel like we have put that. Hopefully, we get to create some value for everybody. I'm just saying that, there ought to be this sort of constant re-examination of what we're doing is the right thing.
And especially
the value proposition.
Contract.
Yeah, and everybody's a volunteer on this, so we're not. Anyway, I just wanted to add that to the conversation in terms of one of the reasons why I think we're asking for this.
Thank you. Do we need to make any sort of a motion on what we just discussed, or are we okay?
No, I think we're okay. We can certainly notify the board. I'm just thinking out loud from a timing perspective. We can give it to you when we first receive any indication from the DCSU. But I do want to point out that that's always a working process of a number of back and forth between us and the SEU on different positions and different research before we ultimately get to a point where DOE can render our opinion on a proposed modification. So we'll send it to you as soon as we are aware of it, but just so that the board understands, it may not come with DOE immediate position on a proposed amendment.
That's good. Thank you. Do you want to keep going?
Yes. The second set of amendments, which is indicated as Mod 2, starts on the top of this page. And this, again, is not a cosmetic modification. that really had to do with the due dates for submitting the first draft of the SEU 5-year strategic plan in their annual reports. These delays came in as a result of the SEU trying to do a really robust process of reaching out to various stakeholders, and the time it took to getting some responses back from all of the stakeholders resulted in a request to extend some of the due dates for completion of the reports that were supposed to be submitted to the agency, because the contract did clearly specify the dates when the reports needed to be submitted. The third modification, which was done again on September 28th, this is a modification where we made a tweak to the benchmark in the sense that we clarified what the 10% energy savings from the low-income benchmark represented. As originally drafted, the contract states that the DCSU must expend at least 20% of their annual expenditures from the SETF on low-income programs, and those programs must create at least a 10% savings from the spending that is done. But what it didn't really specify, it says 10% of the overall savings, which meant that the DCSU wouldn't know what the low-income savings target would be until they get to the end of the year. For example, if they're operating at full steam and they're at 90% of their target for the year and already have 8 or 10% of the low-income benchmark in the bag, if they wanted to go an extra 10%, that means that they have to increase the amount of low-income savings that they're going to be getting, and projects don't always work out that way. So it was a situation where we needed to specify a hard number for that 10% cap as opposed to just simply saying 10% of overall savings.
So this does go to a benchmark,
Yes.
so that's important. And if I'm understanding, are you saying that this was a translation of what 10% means in terms of quantifying it? And
Yes.
megawatts?
Yes. For example, on the electric side, the SEU is required to save about 86,000 megawatt hours in the first year, which means that when they accomplish their low-income spending, at least 8,600 of those megawatts needed to come from the low-income program. But what if the SEU hit 100,000? It meant that getting to 100,000, then they would need to find at least 10,000 worth of low-income savings to meet the low-income target, which again, you really don't know the end result of your low-income target until you figure out what your overall savings will be. So it became a kind of a disadvantage for the SEU to go after bigger savings beyond their target, or even bigger savings as they come up, because on the back end you still have to figure out, if I end up at 100,000 and I don't have 10,000 worth of low-income savings, then I'm not hitting my low-income target. So we just simply specified it, and instead of having a moving target, we capped it at a hard number. This figure here in the contract,
But Lance, but
Yes.
That would seem to help me with the the concept. That would appear to lower the low income target,
Yeah.
because it puts a force ceiling on it.
no, it doesn't lower the low-income target. For example, if you're looking at the contract right now, the low-income target is 86,000 megawatt hours in the first year. If I can scroll all the way down to the table just to show the board.
But that's based upon the SEU reaching the 86.
So this is the full megawatt hour target for year one, 86,473. Okay. Now, at the SEU, if you assume the SEU hit this mark, it meant that at least 8,600 of these megawatts need to be attributable to low-income programs.
Right.
So now, take for a second, if that number changes, let's suppose that number becomes 100,000. If the SEU achieved 100,000, they did very well, above and beyond their required target. 100,000 is good, but it means that if you don't have 10,000 to show on the low income side, then you would not have achieved that at least 10% of the savings coming from the low income programs. So every time the SEU go above this target, it means that they have to also raise up the amount of low income savings that they're getting.
But that was the point though, wasn't it, of having it move?
No, it wasn't. The point wasn't to have it move. The point was to make sure that they're not just spending their money just to meet a spending target. We wanted to make sure that that spending would come in with a certain amount of energy savings out of it.
Right, but it would be achieving that additional delta of energy savings in the low income arena. So if the whole pot gets bigger, then the subsection or the subpot attributable to low income would also get larger.
Well, it means you would have to spend substantially more on low income. For example, if you're doing a large commercial project that can take you to that delta between 86 and 100, it means that you then have to go and turn around and find an additional low income project to do simply because you're increasing your savings on the low income side.
But so now where would that differential be spread after increasing the low income target? So it goes from 864 to 100,000.
Well, if I can add, it's the 10%. The way it was structured in the original contract, it's a moving target. The more they achieve overall, the more they have to achieve in low income. So there are certain projects that close at the end of the year on commercial. So if they close those programs, then they'll have to then find out more low income programs to hit that low income benchmark to be 10%. And that's a disincentive to close the big projects at the end of the year.
You want to speak to that?
And so.
Okay, I'm having little difficulty following the benefit flow. So are you suggesting that it would be a disincentive resulting in SEU doing your commercial projects just because they don't want to have to search around for more a low-income program?
That's one possibility.
But doesn't, and I'm sorry, I'll speak a second, but isn't there an incentive to do the larger commercial project because then you get closer to or hit your maximum target?
Right, but then,
And then there's
yes.
more.
You guys have really got to let Ted
Okay, Ted,
speak to
please
it.
go ahead.
Why could you not live with that target as it is? Why did you?
The target as originally laid out in the contract, as I think has been stated a couple of times, was a floating target. And as we are working through the year and trying to establish what we want to achieve by the end of the year, we thought that it would be more realistic to say, let's set a target based on this maximum here. So the target that we have set for the low income, that 10% savings, is based on this maximum target here. It's not based on something lower than that. So it has not lowered the target. It has said we will achieve 10% of this maximum annual target that is stated in the contract. And that's the way it was set up.
Does it function as a disincentive?
If the amendment had not been accepted as we moved towards the end of the fiscal year, if we had a large commercial project that, where we could take advantage of it and include it in our savings, it would have then forced us to find and spend on a low income target, which can be a difficult adjustment to make, when you're talking about sometimes a matter of only days left to close the fiscal year. You don't necessarily have all of those low income projects available to you to also pull the trigger at the time that you're pulling the trigger on a larger commercial project.
Well, if it's a multi-year contract now, isn't there also an ability to make up the difference the next year?
Not on the low income side, because the low income target is evaluated annually, not on a multi-year basis.
I'm in trouble with the math, as you know, math is not my forte, but
I think that there's I think that there's a good faith to lock in the 10% of the maximum goal, but I think there's a policy consideration that the board is looking at saying, but do we want that? It may be that we want it to float to a, that it can expand.
As we understood the board's intent, as when the original contract was put out as an RFP, when this goal was established in the RFP, we understood that the board wanted to see both spending in the low-income community and impact, at least 10% impact. That was what we understood as the intent of revising the goal from that which it had been in the prior 5 years, which was simply you spend this amount in the low-income community. So remember, first contract, from 2011 through 2016, we had to spend 30% of our annual allocation in the low-income community. In this contract, that 30% spend gets reduced to 20% spend, but you also wanted to see at least 10% of your overall savings coming out of the low income. So that's why we have set a fixed figure for the low income based on the max, not on anything lower than that. So it's not saying for instance, in 2017, and you'll get those results probably in a few weeks, if we had achieved something lower than the max on the energy savings, that's something lower than this 86,000 in January, we still would have to hit the higher number for the low income savings piece because we have a fixed number there now. Are you with me so far with that logic?
Yeah.
So this really forces us every year to make sure that we are maximizing our opportunities in the low income space.
But if you had a project that pushed you from 86,000 to 100,000, a commercial project, which is a good thing,
right,
where would that show up in your benchmarks or in your remuneration?
What we would do is we would be remunerated for the maximum on the electric side, let's say this one here, and then carry over that excess 14,000 or so savings into the subsequent fiscal year of the contract.
So is the issue that it's an annual low income target, but a thing or 5-year overall performance target?
It sounds like that may be the case. But that's the only real constraint on making the low income a moving target and subject to amendments and adjustments.
It seems like all boats should rise.
What makes me uncomfortable?
Right. Well, see, Vicki, this boat. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. This boat stays stable. Like I said, in a given. Remember, in prior fiscal years, we've not achieved the maximum for the energy. However, under this contract amendment, we would still have to achieve the maximum for the low income side. So even in a prior fiscal year, take FY 16, 15, any of the prior fiscal years, we've achieved somewhere between this minimum goal here and this maximum.
For low income.
For the low income, yes. No. For the overall savings, we've achieved somewhere in between these two numbers, the minimum and the maximum. The way this amendment is set up, it forces us to target our low income savings off of the maximum goal.
For that year.
For every
year. Well, but it's been signed, so I guess.
No, but I think that the conversation, at least I think it's helpful to us to hear the policy consideration. And I think this is something that should come to the board for advice before we do it. Because on the one hand, we certainly see the logic of, when it floats both ways, we take the risk both ways. So by locking it in, that 10% of the 86 is locked in so that you remove the risk to the low income, most vulnerable residents that you want to get resources to. But at the same time, it doesn't create a disincentive or a penalty of any kind to the SEU by surpassing the maximum goal. So it's an interesting policy conversation that I think there's good points on both sides that the board should Councilor.
I agree.
I do too, and, you know, just in terms of policy and what makes me somewhat uncomfortable is that, you know, the whole concept is aspirational and that we want to leave, you know, all of the segments and put them all in a better position. And at best, from my understanding, is that this would put them arguably sort of at the status quo. Now, I understand that there is the possibility that it could be lower if there wasn't the ceiling per se, but how often did that happen? And my recollection, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't have the figures in front of the charts in front of me, but under the old system, the low-income benchmark was met, and the concern that was raised by the board was that the spend was done, and we just couldn't quantify the savings. In point of fact, there may have been, you know, significantly more than a 10%, but we had no way of measuring it. So I would, you know, hate to be in a situation where a de facto 10%, when in point of fact, you know, you've been achieving 20% or, you know, 15%.
Well, if I can just point the EM&V reports that we've done over the last 4 or 5 years, they do quantify the savings that come out from the low-income sector, and that's all hovered between 7 and the max they've ever achieved was 10% on the low-income side. You can gather that from the EM&V reports. This would be the larger reports where we dive into each of the individual programs and what they contributed to the portfolio. So I can certainly point you to where those are, and not to put, and not to put too much of a finer point on this, but this benchmark also requires the SEU to achieve the spending, so it's really tied. If they hit just the savings but not the spending, they would not have met this benchmark, or vice versa. So they have to do two things at the same time. They have to spend the minimum amount and also achieve the required level of savings in order to be able to consider to be successful for this benchmark.
So can somebody just...
So that in your assessment, what I hear you saying is that the 10% is a reasonable reflection of the historical savings achievement based upon the EMV analysis. 10 years, 10% a year, blah, blah, blah.
Yes, it is a reasonable assessment, and it becomes even harder in the out years as much of the low-hanging fruit from the low-income space has already been served by the DCSU. So it's going to be quite a challenge year over year to try to achieve a 10% savings. Okay.
That's helpful information.
Hey, Lance, this is Sean Scully. Is there a therms target as well, or are you guys just benchmarking that off of megawatt hours?
No, it's off of the MMBTU. So that's a very good question, Sean. We've just been talking about the electric side as an example, but right below the electric is also the gas savings. And as we mentioned before, when the SEU try to show accomplishment for this benchmark, they have to hit the gas and electric savings. So what we've done is combine those figures into an MMBTU value, hence where we arrived at that roughly 46,000 MMBTU for the minimum. That is based on combining electric and gas savings.
All right. Thank you.
So could I ask, would somebody remind me, please, the origin of the low-income spend and savings target being annual and everything else being multi-year?
Well, the reason was because it was not. There is no legal requirement for that. It's a policy decision that if you make the low-income benchmark 20% over 5 years, there could be certain years where you spend almost nothing and certain years where you spend 40% of the budget. And I think one of the reasons why this was chosen as an annual was to ensure certain minimum amount of money is spent on the low-income sector every year.
And the same thing with for the green jobs benchmark. That's the only one that's also annual, to make sure there's a certain amount of job creation occurring every year, not just waiting, year over year with nothing happening in these sectors.
But those are contract specifications, not legal specifications. No. So maybe you should all. I'm not sure how to solve this today, but I mean, I appreciate.
What needs to be solved?
Or, well, like we're saying, we raised some interesting policy questions here.
I think
And
that's,
there's a contract amendment that's been done. I don't know what power anybody else, on the board to undo or re-examine, but now we've been notified after.
yeah, the contract's been amended. I think that we made the agreement earlier in this meeting that all amendments that go to the substance in the future will come through the advisory board for advice before we do it. So this one's already done, but this is the type of subject matter that should come to the board prior. So I don't, so maybe that's a way of reframing. There's not anything
Right,
to be done.
that was why I was saying
other than-
earlier.
Yeah.
It's been signed, so, okay, any more?
No, that's it for this new contract. We've just done these three modifications.
So, to be mindful of the time, I had also wanted to hear about the prior modifications, because I think those go to the board report. Also would want to hear about EM and B and whether or not we're able to weigh in on those criteria. But we also were supposed to spend time on the report itself, but we're also talking about closed session. So maybe we should just quickly, are you able to tell us now what the criteria are?
Yes. This is the memo that BIGA provided on the issue of the RFP and
Tell
considering
everyone what BIGA is.
BIGA is the Board of Ethics and Government Accountability.
Yeah. While this is being passed around, I just want to make one comment, which I object to a statement made earlier. It was a self-reference to, quote, an old woman. And I believe that the correct terminology should be instead something like a talented and highly experienced person. So,
I would second that.
For the great lengthy experience.
Thank you.
but we need to put this in the minutes.
Appreciate that, thank you.
So this memo speaks about the RFP and the board going into executive session to consider confidential, commercially confidential data and information. However, it does also talk about the deliberate process exemption to FOIA and by analogy to the Open Meetings Act. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but essentially what I interpret this to be saying is that there is a deliberate process exemption where you can discuss certain issues, but it has to be pre-decisional. You cannot make a decision while you're discussing those issues.
Right.
Okay.
The other major thing is that in the final paragraph, it does say you need public notice to go into executive session, which is 2 weeks. So I don't think you can do it today.
We can't do it today, and we would need to have for further time for the report.
Yeah.
I think it's okay.
I think it's okay, and I think we need to do it, and maybe we can do it by phone as opposed to. But I think we got a lot of stuff together here.
Okay. So we will do that. So how do we do notice, invoke notice?
You put it on the website or?
Submit it to the register.
I don't think
For the
the website is good enough.
It's good enough.
Yeah.
Register.
That's what I was just asking as well, if you had to do a formal
Yeah,
notice to
we
the
used to
register.
do that previously, then they said we no longer have to do that, but once you put it on the website for that period of time.
You can also just call Tracy Hughes, the head of the Healthy Government. She's very helpful.
Yeah.
I want to express a concern here. That you can discuss it, I forget the exact words, we just can't make a decision on it. A lot of meetings like this really do result in a decision. It's not formal or anything. It just sort of troubles me. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think so.
And
That you don't believe we should be able to go into executive session?
I'm not saying that, but I think often when people go into executive session, but they can't make a decision. In practice, they do make a decision, though it's not put on paper and then later the decision comes out. So it's just kind of a problem. I don't know quite how long to do that.
So I think fundamentally you're right. I think in this case, we've got a board that is purposely comprised of people that have different views, that represent the broad spectrum of everybody. And I think for our purposes, and particularly for this report, everybody representing their personal and then who they're representing perspectives ought to be able to weigh in with everybody else. I think in this case, we don't necessarily have to make decisions in that, we're not deciding any, contracts, or I think we're just talking specifically about what we want to put into this report, what we want it to sound like. And once we've had the ability to talk privately, I think we'll go back into public session and make whatever decisions we want to make.
I think the report.
Yeah, go ahead.
The report. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The report is a reflection of the work and decisions that the board made during the course of the year. And as John said, it reflects input from a really diverse and in some instances conflicting concerns. And I think a closed session or executive session gives the parties and the participants, representatives, an opportunity to explain among themselves, what their intent was. So that, in my view, it is more, it's not wordsmithing, but it is, explanation of what it was that the board members tried to convey. For example, even in the executive summary, do we want to say it that way? And what was the intent in phrasing it that way? In a closed session, we can explore that more fully, I believe.
Okay.
And I understand, I'm sensitive to your concern, Dan, because I sort of had the same concern, not so much in terms of the board, but the optics, the ever occurring optics of, what will the public say? Why do you have to go into an executive session? But again, like I said in the beginning, that what would come out of that would not be a final product, but, that was making a decision on, that would be, subject to an open meeting. And, even I anticipate that to the extent that there is strong feeling by a particular party that their point of view should be expressed, as we have done in the past, that would be, reflected in the report as a, contrary view, or not so much dissenting, but an independent view of one participant or one representative.
So, sounds like we'll do it. So if DOE could please publish the notice, and then, and was there another I we needed to dot in order to do so?
Well, I think you have to decide when you want to.
Right.
Well, we can't do it for 2 weeks anyway.
Right.
Or is it, 2
weeks.
How's the 2 week period work? 2 weeks to give notice and then we can schedule?
No, you schedule it now, but it has to be 2 weeks notice. So you have to.
Do it 2 weeks following, like if you all
In 2
posted it
weeks.
tomorrow.
Right, if you posted tomorrow, okay.
And I'm guessing it might be a call instead of,
Yeah,
I mean,
probably.
but it's going to be hard to get everybody back together.
Yeah. All right, so maybe we'll send around a doodle poll or something tomorrow after the notice goes up. And then the other part would be then to request some further time for us to complete the report.
Okay.
Does the notice need to include the date of it?
Yeah.
Does it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so,
Maybe that doodle report notice
yeah,
and setting up,
okay.
Whatever. And I have a hard time keeping a straight face when you've got, silly names on what otherwise is kind of an interesting and important, scheduling thing.
So Vicki, I'm okay on the 30th.
Let's send it around. We'll send it around and do a poll.
But you might as well,
The 30th is 2 weeks?
is there
Yes.
some that needs to happen by board?
Well, ideally, if you can give us the date now, we could add it to the notice right
But
away.
it does, you go into executive session, does it require a board action?
Yes, yeah, a
You're
motion.
saying that board action requires notice of date certain.
No, the meeting required notice. That you can do a motion now that you want to go into executive session.
And they don't have to give a date certain, they just have to do it two weeks after they give notice.
Right.
Okay, so you don't have to give a date certain.
Let's make a motion.
But we do for the notice to go out, so, yeah, I'm sorry, I thought we did make a motion to go into executive session, and if we did, my apologies, did we do so?
If we didn't, I would make that motion and then, that we, go to executive session after we've, satisfied all the requirements of statute.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, thank you.
Is it gonna take at least 3 days, business days before the Federal Register? They gotta get this.
Easy.
She's saying we just have to put it on the website.
Oh,
We don't have to do that.
okay.
So if you respond to the doodle poll by tomorrow, we can have it up tomorrow.
Okay. Anyone know how to do a doodle poll?
Lenore.
Lenora.
So can you all help us with it?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thank you. So to be after the 30th, because we're 2 weeks, assuming it goes out tomorrow. Great, thank you. Could we go back to contract modification history of?
Just one question on that. You mentioned requesting another extension. So is that something you wanted us, because Mark reached out to council to request the initial one. I'm not sure if that's the formal request that we would want to get.
Yes, please.
With the last time we requested just 1 week. So would this request be like a date certain, or just it's going to be?
Well, assuming our executive session is in 2 weeks, which is after October 30th would be November. So I'm assuming it would be a month from now. So it would be 2 weeks after the meeting.
30 days.
30 days after the executive meeting?
30 days from today?
Yeah, from today.
Is that all right, or you think we need more?
2 weeks. I think so.
I'm sorry, this is Betty. Yes. So what date are we thinking of?
That would be like the 13th?
The 13th of November is 4 Mondays from today.
Yeah, I think, Sandra, we'll probably both be at the paperwork at the Nuka meeting.
Yeah. That's true. But the report itself,
Oh, the report due on the 13th, yeah.
right.
Yeah, so we can get it done before we do that. I thought we were, sorry, misunderstanding, thinking of a date for the closed
The
meeting.
meeting, the executive meeting.
So
Which I agree
aspirationally,
we need. I've got some real concerns with the draft report. It'd be good to be able to talk about it privately.
we would, have our call about this, 2 weeks from, say even Wednesday, which is, either the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd. And then that would give us, some
At
time.
least 10 days.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm taking it.
I think that's doable for me.
Okay. Does that work?
I promise we won't have to spell it.
That's a challenge. Take an ethics exam or board meeting.
Yeah, really.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, thank you. So if you could please be reminded of the history of the contract modifications that led to the minimum and maximum targets.
The minimum and maximum targets, as you pointed out, came from the way the benchmarks were originally drafted in when we first started this process and we set up the RFP. If you look at the contract, it specified where performance would kick in for energy savings and for green jobs, and the minimum and maximum terms really didn't get used until we started doing evaluation with Tetra Tech in 2012. So the contract started in 2011. 2012 was the first year we evaluated the benchmarks as spelled out in the contract. The specific language that were included in the contract in of itself, it's where the terms minimum and maximum performance were derived from. For example, if you take a look at the energy savings benchmark, as it's spelled out in the original contract, it points to where compensation will kick in. It says the contractor shall receive 25% of the compensation at risk allocated for this benchmark if the contractor achieved at least 50% annual reduction in weather normalized. That term there, if the contractor achieved at least 50%, is what led to the whole development of the minimum benchmark requirement. Because if you have a compensation scheme that speaks to if you achieve 50%, you're eligible to receive a bonus payment, then 50% is the minimum mark, because anything below 50% would then result in the contractor being penalized for not achieving the minimum mark. And again, although these terms weren't originally in the contract, minimum and maximum, they were there. They were implied in the way the benchmarks were defined and the compensation scheme was spelled out.
So I'm sorry. So in the very first contract, how was the energy savings benchmark phrased?
It was phrased in terms of a 1% energy reduction on an annual basis.
How did when did the 25% of the compensation at risk, if there's an achievement of 50% energy saving, was that? How did that?
That was in the original RFP and the original contract.
And so what was the maximum?
There was no the maximum would be the 1%.
So I think what DOE is saying is that when it used the terms minimum and maximum, it was a translation?
Yes.
Of what 25% of compensation at risk meant?
Yeah, 25% of compensation for achieving at least 50%, which is 50% of the 1% target.
And then the remaining 75% of the compensation at risk would occur?
The compensation in the contract, it's split first 50-50 between electric and gas. So 25% is half of either electric or gas.
Kind of hard to do without anything.
So when you talk about 100% of the incentive, it's for both electric and gas. And so 50% is allocated to electric and 50% is allocated to gas.
So let me go back then. When Dr. Long said energy savings benchmark was 25% of the compensation at risk if the contract achieves 50% of what?
It would be 50% of the 1% savings.
Of 1% energy savings.
Yes.
So what does that 50% have to do with the 50-50 between energy and gas?
When you mean 1%, you mean either electric or gas. You don't mean both, correct?
Exactly. It's 1% for both, meaning the electric and gas were combined. So when we say you would receive 25% at risk, you're really just achieving 25% of the target for getting, 25% of the incentive for getting to 50% of the target.
So what I'm just trying to get at is whether or not the inclusion of the words minimum and maximum are translations of what does 25% of the compensation at risk mean?
Yes, they are translations.
Is minimum. And
Yes.
then 75% of the whole 100% of the at-risk compensation would be the maximum.
Exactly. So the 1%, just to give you hard numbers, the 1% when we started this contract represented about 121,000 megawatt hours. So that was the 1% target. If you hit the 121,000, you've got 100% of the incentive available. If you achieve half of that, which was roughly about 60,000 or so megawatt hours, that's the 50% mark. That's where performance kicked in. And then it's on a sliding scale for every megawatt hour beyond that 50%, between the 50 and 100.
Okay, so, thank you. So for the folks who were here, and this was just us trying to piece together the history that was being portrayed in press and our recollections. Does that mesh with folks' recollections of the origins of minimum and maximum targets? I think so.
Les, could you put that in writing, please? Just to break that.
The translation?
Just the explanation, just to make your explanation. I guess it'll be reflected in a minute, but it would be helpful for me personally just to have a breakdown and outline or further delineated discussion point more so than anything else.
Yes, I certainly can. And I would also direct the board that's in the Dropbox is the 2012 EM&V report, which first highlighted these terms, minimum and maximum, because in order to show performance from an impact evaluation standpoint, the evaluated needed to clearly identify where performance kicked in for the DCSU. Hence, you will see the terms minimum and maximum in the EM&V report starting in 2012.
Okay.
So
I think I get it, but I would like to be able to retain it, and that it helps to have it in writing so I can walk through it myself.
And I would ask if you could please supply that to us before our executive session, because I do think that's an important discussion point for us to include in our discussion in our annual report.
Sam, is there anything you want to add to that from your perspective?
Well, the minimum and maximum were used. Minimum was used for when the contractor starts earning an incentive, and maximum is where you earn the full incentive. That's the clearest way I can say it. The terms aren't actually used in the original contract.
No, those words aren't.
Yeah.
But there were thresholds.
Right.
In the original contract.
Right, and in the original RFP, the decision was made by the board at the time, the advice of the board and DOE, that we don't want a knife edge incentive whereby either you hit the maximum, you get the full incentive, or if you miss it by 1 point, you don't get anything. We wanted a sliding scale, and that's why the incentives, you start earning the incentives well below what the so-called maximum is.
And that was with the advice and consent of the board?
Yes. Because we didn't want a situation where if they know they're going to miss it, the maximum, they're just going to give up.
What was with the advice and consent of the board, if this was during my time, was that there would not be a knife edge, but not necessarily the use of the terms minimum.
Yeah, correct.
Is that board members' recollection? Too? Other board members?
Yeah, I do recall that. This is Donna.
I recall the discussion, I don't recall the resolution, but, that's just my memory, so. I think there was extensive discussion about that, to be honest.
Yes, there was.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very helpful. Could we spend some time on understanding where we are in the EM&D contract? The reason I'm bringing this up is because my own perception was that acquisition cost and what is the other one, realization rate, which are I think the two big criteria that Tetra Tech use, aren't very transparent to me in terms and I don't know if that's others' sense, but they don't really tell me a lot about the adequacy of performance.
So first, let's see where we are in the process. You put this out to bid, correct, for a new EMV contractor?
Yes, we have. The RFP closed at the end of September. OCP has assembled an evaluation team, which will start their process. Tomorrow is actually the kickoff meeting for the evaluation team that will get into reviewing the proposals that were received in response to the RFP. Once that is done, then OCP will exercise a contract with the winning offerer.
So when we discussed this was September 22nd, and we heard that that was the timing, and because we're going with the report, we're looking at the EM&V report and saying, how helpful is this? And I think that what you all had said was that the actual language of the contract wasn't, like we're talking about, we wrote in 25% of at-risk compensation, and that wasn't necessarily in the RFP, so that there would still be an opportunity to think about whether or not other criteria may be useful. But especially as we're going into this multi-year, big whole new contract, we want the tool to be usable. And I'm not quite sure how to recommend going about making it more usable. I don't know if other people have the same reaction I do. I don't think we're in a position now to do like a BD&A global, new report on what criteria should look like, but I'm just trying to get that open.
Well, I think what you're getting at is the scope of the work of the contractor that does evaluation, management, and verification. And I don't know where the the right point of intervention in determining scope of work beyond the RFP. But it could be in the final contract review.
But we don't review the contract.
I know, but you can advise us on the final contract. Be sure the scope of the work reflects the work of the board.
And that would be after your selection.
Well, in OCP's process, I'm not sure how much room there is to more or less change what goes into the contract before the contract is signed, because OCP does all of that work independently. What we tend to do is after we receive the contract, if there are things that needs to be changed, we would then seek an amendment or modification to the contract. Because the way it is generally set up, the RFP forms the basis for the contract. And if you're substantially changing things from the RFP to the actual contract, before the contract even gets started, it can create some issues from OCP standpoint. But what I do want to point out very clearly to this board is that there are plenty of opportunities available. There are going to be plenty of opportunities available to tell the evaluator exactly what you want to see captured in the report.
How's that if it's not in the contract?
Well, for example, when we talk about doing an impact evaluation is a very broad and very in-depth process. Stuff like realization rates, all of these things, or even acquisition costs, all that is done as part of an impact evaluation. You would simply point out to the evaluator what are some of the things you think should be highlighted in the report. As we mentioned in our communications to you, Becky, the acquisition cost was something that we explicitly asked for to go into the report, so that it gives us a sense of how the DCSU is really achieving these savings at what cost. It helped inform policy decisions, program planning decisions from the SEU standpoint. The realization rates, all of that is just standard EM&V jargon, which tells us as the person responsible for this contract how well the DCSU are setting up their screening protocols. Because if you set up a program and you run a program expecting to achieve 100,000 megawatt hours in saving, and the evaluator comes in and the evaluator could only verify 90,000 of that, then you'll end up with a realization rate of 90%, so to speak. So it shows you the delta between what the DCSU is doing up front when they're planning and screening and what actually comes out on the back end. And there are a number of other things that go into, the reports. Again, net to gross ratios, all that is standard EM&V language. But the board can clearly say to DOE, we'd like you to focus on X, Y, Z items in the report, or you want to have an understanding of how the DCSU have done in certain areas, and the report will capture those things.
When does that process occur, when you start to make your wish list of what goes into the impact evaluation?
It can be as soon as we have the kickoff meeting with the evaluator to start the process, or it can be right before we start drafting the report, because they're going to spend quite a time doing some analysis of the data. But There's several processes along the way in which you can say to the evaluator what you'd like the final report to reflect.
So I guess before I take up more people's time on this, does anybody else have the same perception that I do that focusing on acquisition cost and realization rates are not necessarily as illuminating as they could be for performance, or is it just me? And if it
Vicki, I don't think it's just you. I think there's a number of terms that probably could use, that we could be, that could be clarified for the board. And particularly given that we have new board members, as well as the, what did you call them, Dan, the talented board members? It would be helpful.
I think it was only the women.
I struck the word.
Thank you.
That's probably two, so Dan and I are sitting here. Probably just the one.
No, so I guess then the question is, if there is opacity in the current way that it's being performed, then the question would be, how would the board most effectively make recommendations as to where there would be areas for improvement? And I know that this is totally out of my area of expertise. There's many areas that are totally outside of my expertise. And I don't know if, for example, just throwing it out there, the board always has $9,000 a year to spend on something, and it never does. I mean, is this something where the board needs a consultant to assist it in saying, how are other EM&B reports done on certain programs? Are they always done this way? Like energy efficiency in Massachusetts, I know that has some extensive EM&B. Is it done using these same criteria?
It's funny you bring that up. Betty Ann can probably speak to this as well when we were at a conference not long ago. This is a continuing conversation.
EM&B.
EM&B, yes. For public service commissions that have our role in some of this, and certainly the energy directors, the offices of energy. So, if I remember right, there was someone that gave us a presentation at our conference that's available as a consultant to talk to us more about it. But this is a continual conversation of how you do it.
Okay. So it would be beyond our 9,000.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's Benny Ann. I'm getting distracted. I'm working from home and they're cutting the tree in front of our house. I want to make sure they do it right. Don't take it down. I'm sorry. Yes, I think that's an important point. That the SCU isn't expected, either by its contract or by the law, to be doing all of it. That the commission's got a very important role and a continuing role in energy efficiency, but also primarily in renewable energy, as does the OEB, and that there are other programs that I never saw an intent for the SCU to do it all, or to be held responsible for doing it all. SCU's got writing some comments on the draft report. The SCU's got a specific obligation about reducing energy consumption, reporting on that with energy efficiency. But in terms of clean energy and renewable energy, there are other entities that have probably a more primary.
So I think on the one hand,
and yes, there are also provisions that require that there are opportunities in the law and in the program for coordination.
So on the one hand, you want to verify that what the SCU claims that they did actually did it.
Yes.
That they did, and that it was done as a result of their action,
Right.
as opposed to either other agencies' actions or just other private sector actions or just consumer actions. I mean, we've had the energy consumption, electricity consumption, I should say, not consumption, electricity sales in the district have gone down by 3% since 2011. From 2011 to 2015, the amount of electricity sold in the district is down by 3%. It's 3% less was sold in 2016 than was sold in 2011. Whereas our population has gone up by 13% in that exact time period. So, as it says in the law, at least in the revised law, how much is due to SAU programs. That's what has to track. And that's hard. But that is, and then there's been a great increase in renewable energy generation capacity in the district. We're up to over 3,000 rooftop installations. We are up to, I believe, 41 megawatts now of installed capacity in the district. Some of which, probably a small part of which, is due to the SAU, and then the rest of it is due to other things. But that's not the primary focus of it.
And I just wanted to comment as well. I remember we engaged in a lot of discussion regarding this very early on, regarding all of the actions that were being taken by consumers, actions that were being taken through other programs that were in place. And through the EM&D process, there is supposed to be significant efforts as well as methodologies in place that are to contemplate the other actions that are taking place. But as Chairman Kane said, that is difficult, so that the DCSEU is actually getting the credit for the areas in which their programming and other activities are ultimately impacting and decreasing energy usage in the respective areas is specific to that entity versus others. So in that process, it is supposed to be able to account for that.
But where is that reflected? I mean, and that's, I guess, obviously the question, the important question.
And that's where we would have to drill down deeper. I just remember significantly the discussion around that, and based on the methodology, all of that is to be considered, but a question should be raised. And I think it's conservative sometimes as it relates to the results that are ultimately yielded when it's taken those things into consideration. But perhaps we can get some input from Tetra Tech on how that has been accounted for.
And that may be the area where a independent consultant to the advisory board would be appropriate, because Tetra Tech, they have their own methodology, and we don't want to necessarily be in a position where they are just justifying, their particular methodology, which may or may not accurately account for that differential, for the difference.
What's your time frame for concluding your contract negotiations or evaluation and then contract and then kickoff meeting for the next contract?
I will need to get back to you with that from OCP with a date certain. If I were to guess, I would say at least by the end of November we should have a contract in place, because today, October 16th, if the panel takes about 2 weeks to go through their review process and get back to OCP, and then they do what they needed to do, we should have a contract by the end of the month. But I would need to get back to you with a date certain, because they're controlling this entire process.
So I'm just trying to figure out if there's time for us to figure, I don't know, do we have a little work group? Do we hire a consultant with our 9,000? If Tetra Tech isn't yet the contractor, we can't have them come in and talk to us. So, in response to Dr. Cooper's suggestion, which I think is a good one, except that we can't, hear from them yet. So, it sounds like we could take it up at the next meeting, but I think that we need to be informed, have something to say.
So, if I hear you clearly, are you asking to have a consultant to be able to tell the board what should be captured in an EM&V report?
Well, I threw that out there, yes, it's a possibility, even though I don't think our $9,000 will go very far. It'll be like a half an hour of some consulting time. So, maybe there's a grad student out there who can, but it also seems like we're not going to be able to invent the wheel. This is a giant topic for discussion under many programs nationally.
Let me reach out to NASIO. Teresa and I will do that. We'll reach out to NASIO and ask them if there's someone who's been consulting with other states that would have their perspective, because other states do this differently. They may do direct, rebates, and then they have to measure what the impact is. But everybody's trying to figure out the same thing: is what's the impact of these investments. And so I do think there's some folks out there trying to help people like us at least be able to think through how to measure.
Okay.
And look, but what somebody brought up, I think it's Donna, or whoever, or Deanna, about the overall impact of the city versus extrapolating from each effort. The number of bulbs, the number of, how you extrapolate from the micro up and from the macro down.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I'm sure you. I would think the Department of Energy, which has been involved in this stuff for many years, must have developed a very good evaluation of energy efficiency. It really is worth talking about. Also, we know that other states have done evaluations, like in Massachusetts. And why couldn't the SEU simply make some contacts and get hold of these things? I don't think it would be that hard to do, or take that much time. Go ahead, hire a consultant. That's one concern of mine. I don't know. But on that first one, what about that?
Or, and I hate to even suggest this, but or in the alternative, maybe a 1 or 2 member of the board could compile, information from the various states. Now, the problem, they would not be able to analyze it per se, so it would essentially be almost a Dropbox of information. So I don't know if that is as value driven as something which would come with some sort of an analysis or evaluation or prioritization of merit or, apples to apples comparison. But that, as Vicki said, may be more expensive, more of a challenge than we have within this given time frame, within our time frame.
Mr. Wedderburn, in response to your question, if the board did not see it as a potential conflict of interest, we would not mind trying to assist you in this research endeavor. I just want to make sure that the board members don't perceive it to be any sort of a potential conflict, since we are the ones who will ultimately be evaluated by some criteria that we might suggest. So I just want to lay that caveat out there up front.
And the fun part also is that unlike rebates, we put a lot of social goals into our investments about hiring, low-income investments, things that are not $1 invested gets you this much return. So to be able to kind of look at the special narrative that DC has decided for these investments would be very important. I'd still be willing to reach out to NASIO, because I'm sure we're not the first ones to add that in. It's just different from straight rebates.
And maybe we can ask John Mizrock about DOE, if they have anything off the shelf, like the new, because we haven't looked at the question since 2008, or whenever we first examined the question of what should be, maybe at least the board.
They want us to use coal now.
Yeah!
Years ago, I
was just going to say that Lawrence Berkeley Lab has a whole series of stuff they're doing on the end, approaching these questions, and they have webinars. They have pick them up. But Lawrence Berkeley does.
Yeah, no, they're excellent. That's a good idea. But I agree also with Sandra that we probably need a little group of people who can focus on that, so we'll look for volunteers. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I'd be happy to volunteer.
Great.
I used to, this was many years ago, I used to head up I was responsible for DOE for the evaluation of energy conservation program.
Oh.
We didn't have say maybe I'm anyway.
Well, OPC would volunteer to participate, but I do think that the group should be relatively small so that it can, so that scheduling and all of that wouldn't be difficult.
Yeah, and we've had good suggestions, and you're
LBL.
Yeah, right. Now I have a second
And
question.
Okay.
I have a second question. It has to do with the cost of the evaluations. I remember at the very beginning when Tetra Tech won this contract. Well, first the SEU sets aside a certain percentage or amount for evaluation, and it seemed to me to be excessive, even though it might have been within some guideline or something. I also, on this...
That's no longer the case. It's not being paid out of the SU's pot anymore.
Oh, it's not?
No.
Oh, who's paying for it?
It's coming out of the DOE's administrative allocation.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Because I didn't see it on this.
Yeah, that's why it's not there. That's the SU's expense.
Yeah, this is SEU. I didn't see anything about evaluation on it. Okay. Well, that makes a big difference, I guess. But I always thought it was a very excessive amount that was set aside. Now, I'm not sure that SEU expended what you had planned, and I'm hoping it was quite less than that for these evaluations. The other point is, over time, you all have built up quite a database for evaluators to use, and that should have the effect of lowering the cost of evaluation, because a lot of this data is available, it's been there. So I just make that point. Finally, I used to know a young woman, I still know a young woman who worked at Tetra Tech. This is years ago, and we're both, in our 20s. By the way, she went on later to work for the Clinton White House. Started on the first day and was there for 7 years. And then she was appointed to a 9-year term at TVA. I mean, and when I told her about what we spent on that first evaluation, she was shocked. She was just totally shocked. So I just question. I think you get my point. It makes a difference now that SEU is not involved. I kind of like to see how much they actually receive over these years.
Right. Mr. Wedderburn, I think it would be important to note how much money was set aside for the evaluation versus how much was actually spent.
I said
on
that.
an
I
annual basis, because
purposefully
there's a
said
delta.
just
There's
that.
probably a delta there every year between.
Yeah, I purposely made that. And in fact, it was based on a conversation with you after a meeting like that, before a meeting. I know exactly what you mean.
But the department would ultimately make the decision as to how much was spent in a given year, not the SEU.
Well, since it's not the SEU, I don't know if it matters.
As much as we're probably. This is Sandra. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave. If you establish a time frame or meeting, then we can talk. I'm willing to work with anyone who wants to at least begin to compile some information, and that would not preclude, going through DOE or any other reasonable source. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
You don't need me for a forum on any other decision or vote at this point. Thank you.
No, we got to close it down. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Could you guys just remind me, do we have anything scheduled on another meeting?
No, we haven't set a date yet. The only thing we talked about is possibly 2 weeks from now,
For
a
the
closed
report.
door, but
Right.
we haven't even discussed when would be the meeting after the closed session, so.
Okay, so we should set those up. We historically, I think, just had them, arranged in advance, and I think we're on a monthly schedule, so we should try and figure out when the next report would be. And I know we were still waiting to schedule the discussion of the O&M. I'm sorry, the administrative, internal, external, which would be for the next meeting. But we also now have these issues, the EM&D. So we will want to see reflected in the minutes that we're gonna, several of us have some deliverables on moving forward with EM&D, and we'll have a small group, but I think Dan Wedderburn and OPC and maybe others will be participating in on that. You guys are gonna get us an SEO. Dan Cleverton, are you able to volunteer to get us anything from LB&L?
I'll see that.
Thank you. Cool. And does anybody have any other sources for that? Oh, I'll ask Ms. Rock about DOE to get some information on that. Then the other next thing is that we're going to have a doodle poll and set up our executive session and ask for an extension of time for the report, but then we'll, set up the next meeting. So I don't know if you want to do that by doodle poll or how.
Yeah, we can send out 2 polls just so members are clear.
Okay.
One for the executive closed door session and another for the next board meeting.
Okay.
And if I heard you correctly,
Yeah.
you'd like to have that done a week after you have the executive session? How do you want to stagger
So
that?
probably, so that's the weekend of the 13th is when we're going to turn in the report, and that means we're in Thanksgiving week. Or, isn't it 20th? Or is there a week in between?
I think it's around the 22nd is Thanksgiving. So
Either week of the 27th.
Yeah, so I think there's a week in between, so let's try for the week of the 20th. To have a meeting, our next meeting?
Thanksgiving is the 23rd.
Right.
So that is the week of the.
So the 27th.
Okay. So the
The
following.
week prior is the 13th.
Should we do, what do we think? If the report's in on Monday the 13th, should we try and meet that week or meet after that? The last week of November. Maybe we could send a poll for the week of the 13th and the week of the 27th. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks all. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Are you going to the EVA conference? Are you going to the EVA conference?
Yes, this afternoon.
This afternoon? Yeah, I'm gonna try to
Ted Tree.
rush over there.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, they aren't doing as lunch this time.
I know. Yeah. Are they not doing it either day?
No, they're doing it tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Okay.
I don't.
So we're getting cut tomorrow, but not today.
If there's ever time.
Okay. And then they're sending everything like in the electronic thing, so I'm like,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
time these
yeah.
things really start here?
Yeah,
Well, I had
it's
to
like
pass
1 o'clock.
my
Session
Yeah.
starting at 2. There's just something in the first hour.
Yeah, that's, I was,
I'm still getting
because
caught
it
up
says
on
1 to 1:15. Oh, here it is. CEO roundtable, 1
Right, 2:30 is the first session, and then there's some
breakout.
round table and from 1:15 to.
Yeah, okay, perfect, thanks. I was so confused. What time am I actually supposed to be?
That sounds like
But
a
understanding the
Well, I'll
basics.
see you there.
Okay, yeah, see you there.
To help you understand some of
Did you get that?
more nuance.
Beautiful for 13th or 13th and 27th, beautiful.
November
13th and 27th.
I used to know.
No, that would be something.
Okay, thanks so much.
The fluctuation is what I was
The results of the report don't fit into the
We can sit up there and claim whatever amount of energy savings we want.
The doodle poll dates are?
Compensated also.
Week of 13th November and week of 27th November for a meeting.
And the closed session is 2 days from tomorrow. 2 weeks from tomorrow.
Yeah, so it's gonna be the 30th, week of the 30th. October 1st. For tomorrow, this will be. It will be. You have to do it like 31st or November 1st, something like that.
Right, the current one is
Tomorrow.
that's a great idea. Reach out, that'd be great, reach out. Right, okay. I know people also there.
And Lance, the FY16 EM&D report was published around.
Yeah.
June?
It was June 12th, that's when the 3 months.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, right.
No, June 12th. Because it's October, was it July 12th? It was July 12th, that's the 4th. The October 12th was 90 days after the board got the
You're talking about when it came out to the board?
Yeah.
It came out to them, I think,
July 12th. July 12th.
July 12th?
Yeah.
The lack of oversight.
Right.
And they just.
No, I've been.
I thought you said it was going over a little bit there.
Yeah, that's what I always, I can
That's
my
This is why I like to send people talking 2 cents for you and for yourself. If I check out something
I do. You too.
I'm going to my party this afternoon, so energy bar party.
Okay.
And then I'll be on deck tomorrow as well.
Absolutely.
So what do we need from you in order to request a closed session? Don't you need to send something to, do you need to engage Tracy at all? Because last time she said we did it wrong. She sent me an email to say the last closed session we did incorrectly.
What did she say?
That's why I went back to my office and tried to find her email on it. But
I can try to send her an email tomorrow asking her today and later tomorrow asking her how interpretation.
Just trying to get our new test.
I want a big discount.
can you shut this off?
It's not fine because it's a deliberate process. It doesn't matter what.
It's not all.
So you're.
No, it's exactly. Thank you. Thank you.
I work with a lot of people.
And even your reply, I'm not into the restaurant, but I'll do that.
Oh,
Okay.
And I see that you really break down all of it. You're pretty smart.
So, can I know if you're having
which bullet? Where would the bullet be?
When I've been streaming, I think I like something about. Okay. Interested in like the whole time?
Well, no, that's why I told you I couldn't tell that what I did turned off. See, we still showing. Stop.